Well, welcome one and all. Happy New Year if it's not too late for that. Hopefully it's a better one than last year, as you might say. So anyway, this evening's presentation, we've got Matthew Torok, who's going to talk to us about his experiences and passions, concerning competition lawnmowers, but competition not in the sense of stripes. Well, perhaps there are stripes involved, but not the sort of stripes that you might see at Edgbaston or something like that. Rather sort of concentric circles, perhaps more is the like. But anyway, Matthew's one of our off-highway vehicle engineering students at Harper, and tonight he's going to talk about his passion, as I say. So I'll hand the screen over to Matthew.
Lovely, thank you very much, Simon. So, as has been said, I'm going to talk about basically my passion for ride-on lawnmower racing. It's something that I've been involved with for many years now, and very much enjoyed as a slightly alternative motorsport. But I think by the end, hopefully you'll have seen some interesting insights to the sport that I love. So, as Simon said, I'm Matthew. I'm doing off-highway automotive engineering at Harper Adams. I'm currently in my third year, so I'm now on my placement, where I'm a CAD/CAM engineer at Peregrine MLS. So basically we're a machine shop. So where did everything begin? From a very young age, I've been interested in engineering and practical things. So a particular memory of mine, this is 2009. We always went to the Goodwood Revival. Fortunately, my granddad had a paddock pass, and I remember enjoying looking around at all the classic cars and the fine engineering that had gone on to create them, and watching them racing around the track. When I was 13, it was old enough that I was ready to begin some practical tinkering of my own. My dad had always done tinkering on old cars. He drives an old car all the time. So I got interested from helping him, but it was time for my own project. And whilst the ride-on lawnmower may not be the typical 13th birthday present, I very much enjoyed it. We essentially decided on a ride-on lawnmower because we didn't really have the space for another car or tractor or big project, but stationary engines were boring. And somehow we figured that a ride-on lawnmower was small enough that we could accommodate one and still had all the key features to make it interesting enough for me to enjoy driving around the garden. So where did all the business of racing begin? One day, about a year after, we were driving through a local village and we saw a little sign saying Mower Madness. And of course we had to search that up. So the good old Facebook found some results, and we found that there was a club that raced lawnmowers in my local area. So I'm based in Dorset, essentially they race all over Dorset. So we went along to their next race and spoke to everyone. They were very friendly, and got interested. So I'm going to show you a quick video that highlights some of the things of lawnmower racing, and particularly where it began in the UK.
What's the toughest racetrack in the world? Le Mans? Nürburgring? Spa? Macau? Well, we think it's a place called Wisborough Green, and it's only active for 2 days a year. Forget the 24 hours of Silverstone or even the Wales Rally GB. The Wisborough Green 12 hours might just be the most physically demanding motorsport event in Great Britain. The sport of lawnmower racing in Great Britain was, like all great ideas, created in a pub. The Cricketers Arms pub, to be precise, in Wisborough Green back in 1973. A bunch of blokes were fed up of how expensive it was to get involved in any kind of motorsport. When they looked over the village green, they decided that everyone had a mower in their shed, so why not race them? They formed the British Lawnmower Racing Association, and it wasn't long before the sport took off. It grew and grew thanks to its charming novelty of a lack of need for sponsorship, as the entry fees and cost of building a racing mower is as cheap as you can make it. There is no commercialism or advertising, no cash prizes, and no modifying of engines or equipment, making it, in the opinion of Motorsport News magazine, the cheapest form of motorsport in the UK. All you really have to do is remove the mower blades, and you're ready to race. There are British and World Championships, the British Grand Prix, and of course the Whisper Green 12 Hours. Racing legends have raced and won it in the past, including a team made up of 5-time Le Mans winner Derek Bell and Formula One hero Sir Stirling Moss. Even the McLaren Formula One team regularly enters for their mechanics, who take it very seriously. And in fact, there's method to the apparent madness. At first glance, you smile at these charming machines, but when you get closer, you realise this is actually much tougher than you first thought.
So, having found out that there was mower racing in our local area and going along to one of the club meetings, we picked up a copy of all the rule books and were ready to start making modifications. To get to my first race, there wasn't much that was required. The main things were fitting mud guards. We fitted a foot throttle that bypassed the governor on the engine and putting racing stripes on, racing squares to put our numbers on. It really didn't take much modification to be ready for my first race. And this was the grid at my first race. So when I joined the club, there was no junior class. They weren't really sure where to put me. So I joined in with a half-hour race that 3 of the ladies competed in. For my first race, the machine was quite slow, but I had an awful lot of fun. It didn't take long to go back, make some improvements, particularly regarding the speed. So essentially, to up the speed to begin with, we changed the pulley ratio between the pulley on the engine and the pulley on the gearbox, as these mowers are belt driven. It's the simplest way of getting some more speed. And by my second race, we were going a little bit faster. I was absolutely hooked on the sport. So over the winter, we made some more improvements. As you'll see going through this, basically, whenever I'm not racing, I'm thinking about the next improvements I can make, how I can make the mower faster, more reliable, or generally perform better. There was also a new rule brought in where we had to run side guards. Now, my dad, being the womble that he is, good at scavenging things and working in the hospital, he was able to bring home some ends of a hospital bed, which we welded to both sides of the mower, and these provided suitable foot protection that satisfied the rules. You can also see we've added some padded seat bars. This was because round corners are starting to slide off the side of the seat. So we found the bars very useful to keep me on the seat, basically. Falling off isn't good. There were quite often in race repairs, things didn't always go as well as you'd expect. I think within my second season, they began a junior class and the races were up from half an hour to an hour long, which gave far more scope for problems. Here you can see the full family sport. We have my mum holding the mower up at an angle, whilst me and my dad are crawling around underneath, sorting out the drive belt, which on this occasion had either fallen off or become worn out. So we're replacing this during the race. Some days it's really sunny, and some days it's not. But it's always good fun. Everyone's lovely, and we have good fun racing around fields. I should say that all the fields that we go and race in are fields that we're basically just allowed to race for free in. The club's all just volunteers. Everyone will turn up. Often on the Thursday before, there'll be track building where anyone that can turn up will, and we'll lay out the cones, the safety fences and everything. And when the final race is finished, everyone helps packing the track down so that by the end of the Sunday, the only mark we were ever there is a clearly marked racetrack through the field. So I had some problems with one of my engines and blew it up, and managed to get a slightly more powerful one and ended up going a bit faster. This was on practice day. The race day was a little bit rainy, but we're not the kind that'll let the weather stop us. So this time I was out for an hour long in torrential rain in what turned out to be a very muddy field. And by the end of it, as you can imagine, it was a little bit mucky. This race was a lot of fun. Fortunately, it being wet, it evened out some of the competition advantage that other machines had. So I was able to compete with a mower in the class above, which was a lot of fun. Them finding that the additional power and speed they have wasn't so useful when the wheels were spinning. Certainly not something that I'd like to race in these conditions particularly often. There was a lot of clear up involved, but it was a lot of fun to do. This race was certainly an interesting one. So near the end of the season, you can see there's been some damage to the bonnet. And note the camber of the front wheels. This isn't what would be considered optimal. Actually, within this race, it appeared that my front axle was falling off, something I found out once we were home. I also managed to bend the bar that was linking both wheels and ended up with a huge amount of toe out. And I think this was sort of the point where I started to get more practically involved with repairing the mowers. So you can see on the bottom, we have the original steering bar. It's meant to be straight, tying the two wheels together. It's obviously bent during the race. So I welded some threaded rod into some angle iron. I know it's very crude and not pretty welding, but this was when I was just getting started. Oh yeah, there you go. So my dad just had a very little MIG welder, having done a welding course a few years prior to me getting heavily involved in mower racing. And basically he's taught me the welding that I know to this day. So after using the angle grinder to clear off the two flats, we had a not very pretty but significantly stronger steering bar. And this was a major improvement over the one that bent, and I think we've ever had problems with that since. We go to the next race, where again you can see the field was a bit muddy, but nothing like we have encountered. In this case, it was just a bit slippery. I've also replaced the bonnet as the old one got very broken and started falling off. So this race was a lot of fun. But as you can imagine, it was generally tough to make it to the end of an hour race, especially with something that me and my dad had built on our drive. So you can see here, I'm finishing the race, and my dad, having been out marshalling, was very happy to see that I'd made it across the finish line and made it past the checkered flag. Once we finish racing, our weekend doesn't stop there. For us, we then go out and marshal for the other races. So with the club I race with, Mower Madness, we run, they used to run at least an hour race in the morning for ladies and juniors, and then a 2-hour race for the modifieds in the afternoon. So here you can see I was marshalling and then someone's broken down. So when we're marshalling, it often involves not just waving flags, but either helping push mowers out the way when they break down, or holding them up on the side so that their owners can try and fix something in the field to keep racing. And it's one of the big themes you'll see throughout this, and one of the challenges is the reliability, especially when we're looking at these 2-hour endurance races with machines that we've all built in our garages at home. By the end of that season, I was getting a lot quicker. Here there's Terry, one of the good friends that I've developed through racing. We were always very evenly matched, had very similar engines, and it was always great fun racing him. The track that we had here at Cashmore was always particularly good. They allowed us a very large field and didn't really care if we tore it up quite a lot, as it was going to get ploughed in a few weeks later, being at the end of the year. And you can see here, we had quite a lot of speed around the bottom corner. And it really just made for a lot of fun. And again, continually developing the mower. I think by this race, the only issue I encountered was my exhaust fell off. So I had a brief pit stop to reattach that and kept going. and finished in a really good position, but that's not really what it's about. I was just having so much fun, getting fast, having proper races with other competitors. Then came the time for me to build a new machine. So by this point, Mermans had introduced a junior class, so I had to stick within the rules that dictated. So for the junior class, we had to use an original chassis and stick with a gearbox, as well as there being an engine size limit. So my strategy was try and lower my center of gravity as much as I could. One of the big problems when we start getting up to the speeds that we see is the mowers can become quite unstable, and generally cornering on two wheels is not the fastest way, especially with a standard gearbox where we have open differentials. One of the big challenges I faced here was doing the front, I would say suspension, but there is no suspension, doing the front axle and the steering system to go with that. You can see we've now ditched the angle iron steering bar, but used some tube to reinforce the bar that we were using, having learnt the lessons in the past. About this time I was in, I think, year 10 or 11 at school, and it was time to apply for an ArcRight scholarship. So whilst I talked about my electronics project as my main thing, I also, when I went for an interview, I also talked about the design that I'd done for the front axle. There's a website that gave some recommendations for Ackerman and toe and all the other various settings, camber and caster. And I then worked out what the maximum wheelbase was that I could have, and drew up a diagram showing all the components to figure out how wide my center axle section needed to be. I think they were quite surprised in my interview when I then proceeded to put the entire stub axle setup onto the desk, having shown various photos of the setup. I was very fortunate in that I did get the ArcRight Engineering Scholarship, which has partly helped to fund the hobby. Generally, we don't have any sponsorship within the sport, but obviously being younger, I had limited funds available, so I found that very useful. And at the same time, I was able to use a little shed at the bottom of our garden. It's only 8 foot square, but it's amazing what you can make in an 8 foot square shed. And for winning the ArcRight scholarship, my parents paid for me to have electricity put in my little workshop at the bottom of the garden. And this has really helped me have my own maker space where I'm able to store everything, all my tools and all of the parts, and also be able to make things without getting in the way of my dad and his garage. So I finished up the new mower, got it out to the first race. It performed pretty well. The big problem I found with these was generally the gearboxes. They were a known weak point for me, but the junior rule stipulated I had to keep one. And I tried various things to try and keep the gearboxes alive, generally without much success. You can see sometimes the fields got quite bumpy. This track was so small we were doing sprint racing, and we were going against where the field had been ploughed a few years before. But you can see neither of my front wheels are in the air here, and it was also quite dusty. In this case, we were only doing sprint racing, and I was actually quite glad when my gearbox broke after 2 races, because my back was taking quite a beating over all the bumps. We'll then go on to Ringwood. This was quite a challenging event for me. As you'll see in the video shortly, I suffered more gearbox issues. And whilst the mower ran well in the race, half an hour through, my steering got stuck at full lock and the mower rolled over. It's worth saying now that we do have safety in mind. You can see both I have a helmet. I've also got some gloves that are intended to stop any damage to your wrists. And you might be able to see there's a red kill cord here. So like you have on a boat, we all have kill cords. They go to the ignition coil. So the second you pull the kill cord, the engine will stop. The idea being that if you ever need to stop the engine, you can grab that. And if there's something like a rollover, then my falling off of the mower would automatically stop the engine and generally keep everything a lot safer. Because obviously without the engine running, they weren't going to keep moving. So here's a video of my very frustrating practice day. I just passed scrutineering, the mower seemed to be good, and this is me heading out for my very first practice session of the weekend. you might have been able to hear then the gearbox wasn't happy. So on this occasion, as I was pulling out of the pit lane, the gearbox broke, and there was a very frustrating, I think about 4 hours we spent in the field, taking the gearbox out of the mower, taking it apart, and one of my friends had some spare parts. We were able to rebuild the gearbox, and I was able to begin the race, as well as finish a little bit of the practice day. But quite often I was faced with these sorts of frustrations. As you can see from this photo, I built up quite a good collection of gearboxes. There's also several that have various holes in them, having suffered from the abuse of racing. So again, here's various spare gearboxes I had. I've rebuilt so many of them. I feel like I know them pretty much inside out by now. And after this event, I did start taking this box of gearbox spares. So there's basically everything I should need to fix pretty much any gearbox problem I encounter in the field, should it be required. They really were quite a weak point. The two problems that they had, without a very well functioning clutch, whenever I tried to use any sort of braking, the gearbox just broke. They weren't designed for doing 30 miles an hour around the field, which we were regularly asking them to do. And also doing gear changes, as you saw leaving the pits. Some of the mechanisms were a bit weak, and they had to be very much treated carefully, which I didn't want to do. I preferred going out, spending 10 laps of a race, beating on the mower hard and breaking the gearbox, than if I had gone gently on the mower the entire race. So I was still having a lot of fun, but it was quite frustrating. I also built up a good collection of engine spares. I think over my time with the smaller engines, I blew up 2 of them and had a total of 4 of them that I've used for spares. So what engines is it that we use? In the junior class and the lower classes for Mower Madness, we're limited to a 12 horsepower single cylinder Briggs & Stratton lawnmower engine. So this is standard. We're not allowed to do any internal modifications. Basically, the only thing we can do is remove the governor mechanism so that there's no rev limit on the engine. I think we're also allowed to build our own exhaust, change the airbox and the spark plug, but absolutely nothing is changed inside. So we went off to the next race. This was back at Cashmore, but in a different field. Like I said before, they always gave us good fields. And I believe this race we had an interesting start, which I will show you now. So we had a Le Mans start running across the track and all trying to get the mower started as quickly as we could.
Go! Go away!
Once again, my dad proving very useful as a pit mechanic. So that racetrack is one of the biggest that we have ever been racing at, and always a good race. Again, as I said earlier, they always tend to give us quite large fields, which helps a lot. Once again, this race, I was able to make it to the checkered flag. So again, there's the checkered flag. I believe there's also my dad looking quite happy that once again, I've made it to the end of the race. Really, through my first few years of racing, he was often there helping me. In fact, he was there at every race, always sort of ready, should anything break, to come and help me. To begin with, we only took a fairly basic toolkit out with us. And as you'll see in later photos, that's now rather evolved, so that I've got a lot more capability in the field. So going on to, I think this was my third full season of racing. Here you can see that despite this being a lower mower, I was still leaning over a lot going into the corners, trying to really keep it down on 4 wheels. And again, both front wheels are actually up in the air at the moment. The tracks do tend to be fairly bumpy. We don't generally help that doing lots of laps. It does tend to make the bumps bigger, and it can be quite an art trying to watch as the track's evolving and finding the best racing lines or smoothest lines around all the bumps as they're changing. I've got another video to show you. If for this, watch the front left wheel as I'm getting to the first corner. So as could be seen then, quite often as we're going around, the machine would go up onto 2 wheels. In this case, it was the end of a slight downhill straight. My brakes weren't very effective. So one of the things that I learnt over time, the brakes don't generally work with the junior machines. My strategy was to leave the standard brakes on the gearbox. These were always sufficient to pass scrutineering, which, whilst not a very thorough test, did prove that your brakes worked. Essentially, we had to stand on the brakes, and if the mower could be pushed, they weren't good enough. If the wheels were locked up, you were good to go racing. We did try at various points to put stronger brake systems on, but I found that these only led to even quicker destruction of the gearboxes. So we sort of abandoned these in the later races and just stuck to the standard mower brakes, which were kind of in emergency use. I could use the brakes and they would slow me down. But they weren't the sort of thing I could use most laps, which was becoming more of a problem as I was going faster. And again, in this corner particularly, the wheel light coming up and going on 2 wheels, which was slightly unnerving occasionally. Obviously, I'd rather not go barrel rolling off the mower. So here's another track. I think by this point we're back at Cashmore. In my last season on this junior mower, I didn't actually attend many races simply because I was so fed up of rebuilding gearboxes. They were such a weak point, and I knew that by the end of the season, I'd be old enough to go up to the modified class. So it was worth spending time building a new chassis rather than rebuilding gearboxes. And I essentially only did 2 races. The one that I showed you, where I think my gearbox blew up in about 8 laps. And then I saved the mower for Cashmore because it was always one of the best races with a very large track. But again, here there was a nice hill that we went down and then round the corner. And if you look, maybe not even so closely, you can see I'm leaning to the inside of the corner, but both of the inside wheels are still lifting off the ground. Again, I found this was a problem, not having brakes, and even to the point I was changing down gears to try and use engine braking, although it didn't help me the most. But as it was, I was competing well, I was having a lot of fun, and the mower was running nicely. In the end, I've won 2 junior championships with Mower Madness, and here I was, I think, collecting the second of those. The junior championship is something I take a bit of pride in, as when I initially joined Mower Madness, there was no junior championship. As I said at the beginning, I joined in with the ladies race to begin with for the first, I think, 2 races. And the season after, they began the junior championship. At the moment, I think we have 4 or 5 regular competitors in the junior race. So it's been really nice for me to see that growing as something that was kind of introduced for me to begin racing. And of course, it's nice having the 2 trophies up on a shelf at home. So as I said before, I was now getting old enough. I think it was when I was 17, I was allowed to join the modified class. This is the closest to the UK's normal class for all the other groups. And this is the main race, 2-hour race that all of the men generally competed in, but it is open to anyone. So we got this mower from a field up the road. Someone knew I was interested and they had it rotting away. So offered it to us for free. Me and my dad went and collected it and the build began. So to begin with, I stripped everything down, got down to the bare chassis. So it's a requirement that we have to use the original chassis and it has to be a lawnmower engine. As you can see, this was a brief mock-up. I think by this point, I'd got some progress on the front and rear axles. And I was just placing the engine and steering column on to kind of get an idea of where everything was going to fit. It was always nice, having done a lot of work, to be able to sit back, do a bit of a mock-up and see how everything was progressing. So the front axle that typically all the mowers run, we have some box section in the middle with some end plates where we've got some big rose joints. The stub axles are bought from a site that makes mower racing parts, although some people do make their own variations of. This means that we can adjust the camber of the wheels. The caster is set generally, but I just use a setting from a website that deals in mower racing parts. I've never had any problems with it. On the rear axle, in the modified class, we got rid of the gearboxes. This was one of the main reasons I wanted to upgrade. They were a significant weak point and normally the reason that my weekend of fun ended. So by going for what's called a T-drive, again, bought off a mower racing site, it's essentially a 90-degree gearbox and takes a pulley input to a 25mm solid rear axle. So I was also getting rid of the differential, meaning I'd have a lot more power around the corners where wheels were lifting. One of the biggest advantages was the brake system, which had a massive upgrade. We've had some various brake failures in the past. I've seen people that have boiled brake fluid. We've had a brake disc, an 8mm thick brake disc that snapped in 2. And I believe one race that was particularly hard on the brakes, someone also managed to shear all 6 of the M6 bolts that held the brake disc to their axle. So knowing that a lot of people had issues with the 8mm thick brake discs, I went for a full go-kart system that uses a 12mm drilled and vented disc and the 2-pot caliper that goes with that. So from the little brake on the gearbox to a massive kart hydraulic brake system, obviously that was a massive upgrade and something that was needed with the increased speeds this machine would see. By this point, I was doing all of the fabrication myself. So on the second mower, I did the majority of it, but this mower, I have completely built everything and my dad's had very little involvement with at least the building of the machine. So again, this is down by my workshop. I built a little wooden platform that I was able to build on to avoid the mud. As generally we're building mowers through the winter when the race season is quieter. We don't generally race between October to April, so that's when a majority of the work happens. You can see by this point I was mocking up the steering column and bonnet, as well as having the mud guards for the rear completed. Underneath on the chassis, I did some welding improvements. So I found that the chassis was not very strong in torsion, having done a few little test drives around my garden. So this was something that I was looking to improve. So a lock box section got welded into the chassis and really improved the torsion of the chassis. But this is something I'm looking to improve in the future because looking back, I have added more weight than was perhaps necessary. Around this time, I won a panel beating course. I was very lucky to get. So I sort of, in my application, I said I've got a lot of the practical skills from doing the mower, but I've done very little in the fabrication of sheet metal parts. And it was also on this course that I learned to TIG weld. which a few months after the course finished, I bought myself a TIG welder, which I've used extensively since. In the bottom right, there's a sort of mudguard. This was just the item that everyone on the course made. It wasn't something I specifically asked to, but I decided I could make good use of it on the mower. So you can see the mower is progressing and starting to look a lot more complete. And I've cut up that mudguard I made on the panel beating course, and it is to this day the 2 front mudguards on the mower. I've also added some box section around the foot plates and put the throttle and brake controls on them. So for my controls, at the moment, I have a clutch that's operated by my right arm. My right foot is on the throttle and my left foot's on the brake. Generally, the clutch, once I've started moving, I don't touch it. I don't go near the clutch. On the current machine, I have a belt slipper clutch. So we just use tensioning pulleys to tighten and loosen the drive belt when we want to go or stop. And obviously having the solid rear axle means there are no gears. To change the top speed of the mower, I use different pulleys. So I have taper lock pulleys on the front and rear, making them quick to change, and built the mower with gear changes in mind. So I think I have 1 or 2 bolts and the seat flips up so I can access the pulley. And generally to a race, I'll take about 7 different pulleys, which gives me a wide range of top speeds that I can choose to find one suitable to the track that I'm racing at. So now that I was going up a class with the mower, the engines were a bit less restricted. You can see this is a significantly larger lump than I was racing with in the past. So we still have to use ride-on lawnmower engines, but we're allowed up to a 21 horsepower V-twin. So in my case, this is a 15.5 horsepower Intech V-twin, which I think was about 700 cc's. They don't rev particularly high, even with the limiter removed, because we end up hitting, I believe it's valve bounce. But with them being a large displacement engine and designed for low RPM operation, they do have quite a lot of torque from low down and can really make the mowers go pretty quickly. Behind that, you can also see my fuel tank, which at the time was in place for testing. It only carried a few litres of fuel and really wasn't sufficient for this engine, but it was enough to get me testing up and down the road. Here's one of the bits of welding that I'm particularly proud of on the engine. On the valve cover, there was a port that ran a vacuum line to my fuel pump, which is obviously quite important. And you can see on the right, the bit of pipe that did fit into the hole had broken in half, and so I was unable to run the fuel pump off of this. It was quite a nervous moment when I was welding a barbed fitting on, because any holes here would have been a major problem, and I couldn't get more valve covers or rocker covers. But as it is, I was able to weld the fitting on, and that lasted the life of the engine. So with the mower pretty much race ready, it was time to go up and down my road. Fortunately, living in a very rural village in Dorset, I'm able to just use our road as a test area, and everyone just thinks it's fun, and no one really minds. Having spent so much time and effort creating the mower, I was very happy that everything went well. It all seemed to work. I went up and down the road. I was very happy with the performance. It was when I came back after lunch, I had a rather more disappointing moment when I realised that the chassis had suffered significantly. Knowing what I do now, from particularly the engineering degree, it's obvious that the holes I relieved for the wheel clearance during steering were going to cause a problem for chassis stiffness. You may be able to see some tools and spare parts, or should I say parts from the mower, scattered all over the place as I frantically pulled the front end apart so that I was able to repair the bent chassis. So I used quite a lot of box section to triangulate the front chassis. I also used a few pulleys and some ropes so that I could pull the chassis nearly flat, and the welder turned up quite high to try and bring some heat in. There's also 2 bolts on the rearmost section of the bar which tie into the engine, which I kind of just used to try and improve the strength. So whilst I might not be an agricultural engineer, sometimes box section is the answer. You can see that whilst I added more weight, which in hindsight was probably unnecessary, I was able to flatten the chassis out, and it has proved plenty strong enough since during racing. A bit later on, when I'd added some other components, I went back in and added some extra sort of gusset supports, which tied in the front framework to the box section I ran along the chassis sides. This was really just trying to make sure the front wasn't going to fall off during any races, because I'm aware that the mower does see some serious abuse and some quite big bumps whilst I'm out on the track. At this point, I added some more seat bars. I mentioned them earlier. They really are critical for the sort of speeds we see around the corners. Otherwise, there's no way to keep yourself from sliding off the side of the seat. In this case, I believe we used some old camping roll mats wrapped around these metal bars, and then a lot of tape. Once again, I very painfully learnt early on that it pays to have a lot of padding on these sidebars, given you do quite often get bounced into them during races. And it can be quite painful if they're not properly padded. So at this point, the mower was nearly done. It's looking a lot more like a race-ready machine, and was basically ready to go for competition. There was just a badge to make Mercedes complete. We found that there's many wonderful puns you can make during mower racing. So my team name is currently Mercedes, hence the silver as well as the Mercedes logo on the front. And it was off to my first race in the modified class. So I was now joining the 2-hour race with all the adults. It was a real achievement for me to get this far. So you can see this is the sort of pit garage that we typically had. So we've all got our own little awnings that we'll put up. You can see by now I have quite a lot of different tools that I take with me, as well as lots of petrol. The engine is quite thirsty over a 2-hour race. There's also a pink bib sat on my seat. That was because despite my 4 years of racing experience with the club, being my first race in the modifieds, they insisted that I wore a pink bib a pink high vis during the race, so that other people knew to be slightly cautious and that it was my first race out with them. So it was time to play with the big boys. I had a really good race. It was certainly eventful. I think I had a front puncture, the exhaust fell off, I lost 2 fuel caps. Generally, I was refueling every 10 to 15 minutes because I never quite got round to upgrading that temporary fuel tank. I knew it was a weak point, but as I went into this race, I set my targets on completing 6 or 8 laps, because in the previous 2 years at this track, it had taken 6 or 8 laps to blow my gearbox up. Now that I didn't have the gearbox, I hoped I'd last a bit longer in the race, but I didn't set my expectations very high, given that as a 17-year-old I had built this mower in my workshop from scratch basically, and it wasn't race tested, so there was a long list of things that could go wrong. In the end, I actually managed to complete 156 laps, so I passed my target by a long way, and I did manage to finish the race, which felt like an amazing achievement, especially after all the hours of work I'd put into building the mower, to finally be out racing, absolutely loving it. And again, this was a 2-hour race, so it was a tough test for the machine, and it certainly was eventful, but I was very happy to have made it to the end. And that's really one of the main things that I love with engineering, and especially a project like this, the satisfaction that I get at the end of a race where I know that I've just had so much fun on a mower that I've built in my garage or in my workshop, my dad's garage. It really is a great feeling when it does go right. So now I've got a video. I was fairly slow on this race. It's my first race out with the modified, so I wasn't used to the machine, and my mower did still have a lot of teething problems that I have since worked on. So you can see by this point the mower, the new mower was a lot faster than what I had been racing. I found that having brakes was really quite useful. Something I'd known for a while, but because of the weakness of gearboxes, not had the luxury of. And there was generally a lot of very tight racing. You could see there I was going for fairly small gaps, getting very close to clipping the cones, but generally having an awful lot of fun, actually out racing tight with everyone else. So after that race, I needed to build a new silencer. I don't know if you heard, but on the second video, it was a lot louder as a result of basically my silencer falling off. I bought one off a site that sold mower racing parts, and it had aluminium end caps to the silencer. And it turned out that my big V-twin engine was a bit too hot, and we actually managed to melt some of the aluminium, and so the silencer wasn't held on anymore. So here I got the welder out. It's not the prettiest welding I've done, but it did work, using some perforated pipe and then a sleeve that goes over that, and filled it with exhaust wadding, so that I still had a straight through exhaust, but was able to quieten the mower enough to make it through scrutineering. So in scrutineering, one of the things they check is the decibels of the mower, and there's a limit of, I think, 98, that as long as the mower is under, you're good to race. I also did the much needed upgrade on my fuel tank. Having had to pit stop every 10 to 15 minutes in my first race, knowing that wasn't ideal, it was time for an upgrade. I was happy with my first race because I wasn't expecting to make the first fuel stop. I thought something would go wrong. But now it was time to get a bit more serious. So I've upgraded to a normal ride-on mower fuel tank that's about 9 litres. I think theoretically this will last between an hour and an hour and a half of hard racing. But to this day, I haven't lasted that long in a race without something else causing me to do a pit stop combined with a refuel to know exactly how long a fuel tank would last me. So it was time to go to the next race. By this point, I didn't have to wear the pink bib anymore, which I was quite happy about. And the mower was running even better. I now have the bigger fuel tank, done a few tweaks, and it was a lot of fun. You can see this race was particularly dusty. And that ended up causing a problem for me where dust got into my carburetor and blocked up a jet. But I didn't know about that until a few races after. You can also see here I've changed the steering wheel, and the one that's in the photo is still on my, and that's actually from, I believe, a Ford Fiesta. We used the universal joints for the steering system that are the same out of any car sort of steering rack, and went to a local scrapyard that's helped us in the past, and that's what he was taking apart at the time, so we had it. Between races, obviously sometimes whilst I'm competing we get punctures, and it proved expensive to go somewhere else, so I've made my own little bead breaker. It's very crude, but it does work quite effectively to break the beads of the tyres, and then using parts from my workshop and my dad's collection, I was able to make this sort of crude tyre machine based on what I could find on the internet. So it's actually a Morris Traveller half shaft in the middle that my dad had spare that was old. I've bolted on a mower hub so I could hold the wheels in place, and then use the lever bars to pull around the half shaft to bring the bead on and off the tyre. Whilst it's hard work, this has saved me a lot of money. I can now repair all my punctures at home. I run an inner tube in those tyres. It just provides a bit more puncture resistance, and they're only £5 whenever I do have a puncture. So it's not too bad to replace. So we go into the third race with my new mower. This was a particularly challenging weekend for me, one where I really had to control my emotions in many ways. So I still hadn't figured out my carburetor issue from the previous race. Whilst I had taken apart the carburetor, sprayed carburetor cleaner through it, I hadn't actually seen the bit of dirt that was covering a jet. And for the entirety of practice day, I'd go out and run 1 or 2 laps before one of my cylinders would stop firing. I'd limp the mower back into the pits normally. A few times it didn't even make it back in. My anger when I got in lasted for about as long as it took me to throw my gloves on the floor, and then it was helmet off, get the tools out again, and try and find a solution. In the end, I did take apart certain bits of the carburetor, but never completely enough to see the dirt. And because after 1 or 2 goes I had cleaned it, I made a very incorrect assumption that the carburetor couldn't be the issue. And it's, whilst we get taught things at university about not assuming things and how you have to properly analyze the problem, there's also, it's good experience for me to have had the practical situations and done the learning through doing, as frustrating as this weekend was. In the end, I did compete in the race with only one cylinder. The mower wasn't running brilliantly. I think for about 2 laps, both cylinders were firing, but I still managed an hour of the race before my fuel tank was trying to fall out. I think the bonnet was falling off and various other issues that ultimately led to me retiring. But I still had a lot of fun. And when I got home, I properly stripped the carburetor down and found a stubborn piece of dirt blocking one of the jets. Fortunately, by this point, Mower Madness often had a quad bike at events. They had a tyre strapped to the front of it, so they would use that to push people in when they'd broken down. This saved me a few times because, particularly at the larger tracks, it can take quite a while to push a broken down mower into the pit lane to be able to work on it. We then went on to my 4th race of the year. This was back at Rye Hill, the same field that the first race I ever did with this mower was in. Although each time we go back to the fields, they vary the circuit layout a lot. In this case, we were running the opposite direction around the field, as well as on a revised circuit layout. Here, the mower was running pretty well. I got a lot of my issues dialed out, although I did have one interesting problem. I broke down and it sounded like the rear axle was completely dead. I was worried, having spent a lot of money. I think it's about £200 for the rear axle I had, which still, I think by this point I would have been 18. It's still a lot of money for me. And I thought it should have been tough enough to last more than 4 races. When we got to the pits, I did investigate, an important lesson in not giving up. And found that it was just the key had managed to jump out of the keyway that held the pulley on the rear axle. Fortunately, I had a lot of spares with me. So me and my dad cut a new piece of key stock, put that back in, and I was able to keep racing. And this was the 2nd race that I finished on the mower. There seems to be something lucky about Rye Hill because my modified has finished quite a few races there. Even on the not so muddy races, we still tend to get quite mucky, particularly here it gets very dusty. And on a hot, sweaty day, that then tries to stick to us. It can cause some slight problems, but you hope that your goggles seal well so your eyes don't get too dusty. But you definitely need a shower by the end of a race. And again, it is quite tough work being out there for 2 hours. We then went to the final race of my first season. By this point, I felt like I'd got a lot of the mower's issues sorted. But I fell culprit to one of the big things that I was to change over the winter. So up until this point, my modified was using a centrifugal clutch. This meant on the engine, there was a clutch that as my engine revved up, it gripped. So when I was at idle, I had no drive. This was really nice so that when I was on the brakes, the engine was no longer trying to drive the mower. But it proved that the clutch I had just wasn't strong enough for the sort of racing I was doing. I wasn't that disappointed when I stopped racing after 3 laps here. There was a very steep hill, both going up and down. Going up, I remember likening it to trying to climb a giant staircase. Quite often the mower would do big wheelies, and it was generally very uncomfortable. So I actually wasn't so disappointed when after 3 laps my clutch wouldn't get me up the hill, and I had to retire from this race. By this point, I had passed my driving test and got my own little trailer. So I was driving our Series 3 Land Rover to get to and from events. I thought it was quite a cool mower transport. From quite a while ago, me and my dad had the Land Rover. And one of the constraints with the mowers that I've built so far, they had to be thin enough to fit through the back doors. And we actually just used the Land Rover to transport the mower using some scaffolding planks as ramps. So I used to turn up with my mower in the back of the Land Rover. But by this point, I had got my own little trailer, as scruffy as it was a lot more independent. It was sort of a transition as I went to the modified class. My parents would still very much support me, but generally weren't there for the whole weekend. I'd go to races myself, and they'd only turn up half an hour before I was due out racing. So it'd still be my pit crew, which was very useful. And support me and then help a bit with packing up before they left, and I hung around to finish packing the track up. So having completed my first season, I'd finished 2 races out of 5 that I entered. It was honestly a lot more than I was expecting. You have to remember that I'd built this mower in my little 8-foot square workshop and using some bits from my dad's garage. So really to finish 2 of the 2-hour endurance races, I thought was very good, as well as completing a few hours of practice days. But there were a few big things I wanted to change. So you may be able to see here, over winter, I added a little mountain bike shock absorber under my seat. We're not, the rules stipulate we're not allowed a normal suspension system unless the mower was originally fitted. And try finding a mower of the sort of size that we race on that has full suspension. But we were allowed seat suspension if it was discrete. I copied one of my friends who also raced. I'd had a go on their mower with seat suspension and it was really nice. So I decided I'd do the same. Then I was getting ready to go on a practice day and inevitably found a few more problems than I was hoping for. What was going to be a fluid check, top up, greasing of bearings, turned into a bit of a strip down of the front end of the mower. In this case, you can see my TIG welder, although I was using it in arc welding mode on this occasion, and various of my toolboxes with all my tools strewn around, as is the nature when we're busy trying to fix a mower before the beginning of a race weekend. So this race, unfortunately, I think university got in the way of the race day. It was at the end of the Easter holidays and I needed to move back into uni rather than race around a field. So I just went along on the Saturday as a practice day, just to see if my winter improvements had made the mower any better. In particular here, I changed to a belt slipper clutch mechanism since the centrifugal had given up on me, but it did take a lot of tuning to get the belt slipper clutch to the point the belt was loose enough it didn't drive when I didn't want to go anywhere, but the belt wouldn't fall off, and also that the belt would then be tight enough that it wasn't slipping at all when I was trying to get the mower to go quickly. The test weekend was really good fun. I think in the end I did about 72 laps, more than anyone did on the practice day, because I was just there to practice. I didn't have to worry about saving the mower for the day after. And it showed me that my clutch modification really had yielded a result. I also learned more about fatigue here, where my mudguards were held kind of levered off the chassis, then constantly bouncing up and down over all the bumps, ended up in them shearing all the way along. Again, having learnt what I have at uni, and just generally through my experience, I've now altered their the way they join on so that they're far stronger and this problem won't occur. But once again, mower racing was demonstrating engineering principles practically to me, and I was doing some learning from that. So by the first proper race I was able to get to in my second season of the modifieds, the mower was going a lot faster. I like some of the photos that we got here where the background's fairly blurred. You can see my front wheels aren't really on the ground. By this point, I'd also upgraded and got a back protector or a chest protector to try and help, mostly in the event of a crash, but also try and help take some of the shock of bouncing up and down in a field, so that I wasn't so painful the next day. As you can imagine, generally you ache for a few days after, especially a 2-hour race, the sort of speeds that we're getting up to over big bumps. So talking about the big bumps, here are just a few photos. There are very few photos from this race where my front wheels are on the ground. And the one in the top right, you can see I'd just gone over a serious bump. And whilst the mower looks fairly close to the ground, I am nowhere near the seat. I've always been very specific about the seats that I use, making sure they have a stiff foam so that when I land, it cushions my landing. Some of the softer foams, they cushion the landing so much you hit the metal underneath. So try and improve my comfort, but it is still a bit of a tough ride. You certainly do end up aching, and there are some races you get very achy during. We're moving on now back to Rye Hill. It still seemed to have my lucky charm. By this point, the mower was just getting even faster. Generally, between meetings, I was doing modifications, fixing anything that had broken, which there always were things that had broken. I've had a few throttle cable snaps and various punctures, and generally items that end up on my to-do list or wish list. They get changed between races. but I'll show you a video here my dad took, and you can see that I am getting quite a lot faster. That was the wrong video, sorry. Go there. So there's my mower. I hope that illustrates just how bumpy some bits of the track can be, although this was actually a fairly smooth one. And I think based on my calculations for gearing, by the end of the straight, as I started to brake, I was probably reaching about 40 mile an hour, maybe 35, but it's certainly fairly fast. To this day, I consider this as the best race I've had. Not only did I finish the race, I had relatively minor issues. By relatively minor issues, I mean I had complete brake failure an hour into a 2-hour race. But it remains my best race because that was the only issue I had. I came into the pit, couldn't fix anything, so I kept racing. And funnily enough, at the end of the race, my mum, who had been spectating not from the pit lane, commented that I seemed a second or two a lap slower in the second half of the race. Little did she know that was because I had no brakes at all. But it's still a lot of fun, and I was really happy that everything else worked without an issue. I did, however, find that having finished the race, my throttle cable had 2 strands of it left. I generally were using bicycle brake cables as the throttle cable, and it got better. I developed different ways to stop it braking, but the constant bending still caused an issue here. I've since then gone to a much thicker cable. Whilst it costs more, it's lasted so much better, and put end stops to reduce the fatigue. But I realised I got quite lucky here that I was able to drive my mower back to my trailer and fix the throttle cable at home rather than having another failure at a race. I also discovered the cause of my brake loss. My brake calipers held onto the axle, and there's some pinch bolts on the carrier. These pinch bolts had vibrated loose. The carrier was able to shift a few millimetres over. So on the left photo, you can see the right-hand side of my brake disc is considerably thinner than the left. This is where the disc had shifted over and was rubbing against the aluminium of the caliper, as well as having worn my brake pad down completely. I think this excess heat generated from this also then melted the seal, so brake fluid was leaking out, leading to my complete lack of brakes. By this point, I was able to get my own car. It may not be the typical first car, but it suited me for mower racing. I had a tow bar so I could take my own trailer. And I was able to fit all of my race gear in the back. And there was a great sense of independence when I went off to my first race with my mower in my trailer with my car. And we get to the last race that I've competed in. This was at the end of 2019. Just before I came to uni, actually, I went home to race this race. This was back at Cashmore. It was always a brilliant track. The mower was running really nicely, so I was very happy. Until about an hour into the race, where I had a complete engine failure. And I mean complete engine failure. The conrod was in a lot of pieces. I don't actually know what caused this. I think it was just general stress, having spent 2 seasons of hard racing on the engine. When the conrod let go, it also took out the sidewall of the cylinder. Quite impressive damage that I hadn't managed before. So it was time for a new engine. Fortunately, I already had this 18 horsepower V-twin on my bench as a spare, ready to go. I think this is a 600cc, but it still has a lot of torque and has been running nicely ever since. As I said, at that race, I'd come home from uni for the weekend. I actually brought the mower with me to my second year of uni. I think I must be one of very few students to take a TIG welder with them to university. But I did, and it proved quite useful. So this was in our little garage in the place I was staying. I said to my housemates, I don't mind what room I have, but I want the garage, which they were happy with. So I built a new silencer. This one's a bit more complicated. Whilst I still stuffed lots of wadding around some perforated pipe, rather than having a straight through design, I decided the two 90-degree angles were both better for the location the silencer was going to fit, and also would provide added dampening because the sort of gas and noise would have to go around the corners. And this has actually worked. I really like the noise the mower now has. So you can see this was the new engine installed and the silencer on. I covered it in heat wrap because it's quite close to the bonnet, and it's got a down facing exit to the silencer. Then it was time to come home for a lockdown, unfortunately. I was hoping to get some mower races in whilst I was at university, and I actually had the mower with me and would have had it in the lecture theatre had I given this presentation in person. But obviously that didn't end up happening. So I made use of the lockdown by refurbishing my trailer. Most days ended up doing a bit of welding or cutting the metal up, basically making the trailer a bit bigger, which is going to allow me to expand or make a bigger mower in the future, which is something that I am looking to do. So you can see here I've added a compartment which I never had before. This allows me to carry fuel tanks, spare tyres, spare wheels and tyres, which I take quite a few of. And some other spares outside of my car, which is a nice addition to have, as well as being custom built for the size of the mower, but allowing a wider mower in the future, which I'm looking to do to increase stability around corners. Most recently, I have been able to get out in September and take the mower out. It wasn't an official club organised event, but one of the committee members was able to secure the same two fields for an unofficial practice weekend. There was no racing, there was just a track set up and everyone was free to use it as they wished. Unfortunately, on the Saturday, I had some problems with my steering. It completely broke. So I took the mower home and proceeded to tear it all apart. One of the advantages I have, having built the entire mower, whilst some things may be a bit messy, I do know it inside out. So I know the best ways to work on it, and any faults that I find are generally my own causing rather than anyone else's fault. In this case, I had the whole steering column off and welded the steering shaft up to be a lot stronger, and went back for the Sunday where I had a lot of fun. The mower, this was the first proper test of my new engine, and the mower was running beautifully. I think I'd calculated on the gearing I should be reaching 35 mile an hour by the end of the straight, and I had a GPS that showed I was reaching 38, which I was really happy with. In the past, I theoretically had the mower at about 50 mile an hour, but never had a GPS to prove that. And I'll show you a video here. This was a particularly bumpy track. I think less effort was put into smoothing it out, as it was only a sort of practice test day for us, rather than an official race. And again, here you'll notice a different engine note that I now have with my new silencer. I was very happy with the results of this test day and believe that my mower is now up there with some of the fastest in our club. Certainly one of the fast guys was there and sort of kept up with me, but wasn't able to catch me. But obviously I don't know how hard everyone was pushing with it only being a practice day. But it's given me a lot of confidence, and I look forward to being able to race again and see how my new engine's comparing with everyone else, and really just getting back to racing because it is what I love. So basically that's as far as I've got at the moment. Looking to the future, there are some bigger events I'd like to attend, as well as continuing with the races I do. So there's a Northwest Lawn Mower Racing Association that run a 6-hour endurance race, and the West Midland Lawn Mower Racing Association, based near, not far from Harper Adams, run a 555, which is a 5-hour, 55-minute race. Both of these races I'm looking to compete on my own with. A lot of people will drive or share a mower, so you'll have 3 people to a team. But it is also known that some people will do what they call an Ironman, where they'll do the entire race themselves. I've now got quite used to competing in a 2-hour race and completing this, so I'm quite looking forward to getting a go at a 6-hour. There's also a 12-hour Lawn Mower race as mentioned in the beginning, which I want to go to, but would require a team of people. And in the bottom right, there's a picture from Lavia. So there's actually a 12-hour race in Finland on a frozen lake done in the winter, which I'd quite like to have a go at some point, but obviously needs more planning and money. Now I've got a few other photos from other people racing. So here the track doesn't look very bumpy, but you can see the mowers are still being launched into the air. This is quite a theme. This track, there was between two fields, there was a ditch that we built, basically a bridge over, but on the lead up to the bridge, it kept getting dug out so that everyone was taking flight. And you can imagine that after 200 laps of a track like this, everyone is aching quite a lot. As I said earlier, we don't stop when it gets muddy, but this was a particularly bad race. I think Toby regretted lacking front mud guards by this point. So going back to where I started, there's this photo from me in 2009. Having developed lots of my practical skills, I was lucky to work with a classic car garage, and I've been able to return to the Goodwood revival, this time as a mechanic. And I actually found the same car, so this is 9 years after the original photo. I was looking after this car pictured and done some mechanics work with that. So I spent 2 summers working at a classic car garage now, been to 8 international level classic motorsport events, including going to Spa twice. So this is an Aston Martin DB2 that we looked after, and at the end of the weekend at Spa. And I'm currently now on my placement at a CNC machine shop. Again, found some of the practical experience I've got useful, although this is delving into a rather different area than I've experienced before. At the moment, we're doing a lot of machining for historic McLaren Formula One parts. So pictured is some rear anti-roll bar links for McLaren MP4-6, I believe, machined out of titanium. For this, I was given an original drawing and have just had to create a CAD model, do the CAM programming, and hand over to the machinist who's made it. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I welcome any questions you have about lawnmower racing. I can see there's several in the comments, which I'll just try and have a look at now.
Okay, thank you very much there, Matt. If we go up to the chat.
Okay, so I've got a few questions from people. So I think Alan Plom was asking, do we use any special tyres? So our regulations state that we have to use ride-on lawnmower tyres. As you can maybe see from some earlier photos, there's some slight differences there. So we are allowed to run knobbly tyres, which I think can be bought for lawnmowers and are in standard lawnmower sizes. They give us some reasonable grip in the wet, but there's nothing fancier than that. The next question, have mower manufacturers shown any interest in the use of their machines for racing? Interestingly, not particularly. I think some of the manufacturers get a bit involved with some high performance mower related things, but not generally in the racing arena. Generally, the machines are sort of sourced from quite cheap chassis. So as I said, with the chassis I race at the moment, it was free for me. So we're generally not interested in spending the sort of money that manufacturers' machines would be. And it is very much a grassroots motorsport. I think to get my first mower to a race, we had in total less than £200 in it. So it is a very cheap form of motorsport. Building my modified mower, I think I spent about £1,500. That was to get basically to my first race, and I've probably spent another £500 to £1,000 for the 3 seasons I've competed in since, making constant improvements. So in the higher classes, they're a bit more expensive, but generally we still try and stick to a cheap way, and that's where I don't really think there is a market for manufacturers. I'm just not sure it would be viable. What do scrutineers look for prior to racing? Generally, scrutineering is quite tough when you've got a new machine or at the start of the season. Nowadays, once you've been racing, once they know the machine, they're mainly looking for, does the kill switch work, do the brakes work, and noise level. So a typical scrutineering at the moment, I'll turn up, they'll get us to start the engine, rev the engine high, whilst they take a noise reading to check we're within the limit. They'll then get me to pull my kill switch so that they can see that does kill the engine. And with the engine killed, then I'll stand on the brakes and they'll try and push the mower and see if it can be pushed. When you first have a new mower, they do look more thoroughly and check that things like a fuel tap are in place so you can turn the fuel off, and some finer details within like the engine bay particularly, as to where things have been routed and that all the connections are secure. Is it possible to use a hydro axle instead of a gearbox? No one's ever really used a hydro axle. I'm not sure how that would work with the gearing up that we do. I know that we run the input to the gearbox quite quickly, and I'm not sure how the hydraulic system would cope with that, given that we're not allowed to really modify the gearbox internals in the junior classes. I think basically they're just complicated in a way that no one's really tried to utilize them. Generally, we'll just stick to the gear-driven ones. They're still fairly cheap. And if people race them correctly, they can last for a long time. My main problem was I always wanted to push hard on the mower and race as hard as I could, and the gearboxes just weren't strong enough for the way I was trying to use them. Are we able to do anything to reduce vibration through the seat? So I think I covered this a bit, that I've put a shock absorber under the seat, and you can also add different sort of padding to the seat, but generally you can't do much else. I'm looking in the future to get a more adjustable shock absorber to try and even further tune the damping on my seat, to try and soften the ride even more. But generally it is quite tough on your back, and yes, people do have a bit of a bad back, and we certainly ache. Another question, all the mowers appear to be ride-on type. Are there other categories? And there are quite a few manufactured ride-ons, if they're most popular. So to answer the first question, generally it is the ride-ons that are used. At the club I race with, it's the most popular. You do get some of the roller-driven mowers that people put a little like carriage behind, but they're not as popular. And you also get some of the lawn bug, Westwood lawn bugs that are used. But in the club that I race with, generally it is the normal ride-on lawn mowers. But yes, there are. If you have a Google, there's within the general British rules, what I have a ride-on is a Group 4. The Group 2 lawn mowers are the cylinder-driven pull-along sort, and the Group 3 are the lawn bugs. And for the different manufacturers, there are generally a few favoured. So I've used a Westwood for this build, which a lot of people use. It has a decent chassis that's quite easy to adapt from and quite tough, although I did add the strengthening. There's also wheel horse that are quite popular, more so within the British club. So I think the British club only allow a 13 horsepower single cylinder engine. So the wheel horse chassis is a lot smaller and lighter, and it's better for a lower horsepower machine to keep it strong and be able to go quickly. Do you use the old Tecumseh axle? The sintered pots always seem to break. Yeah, so I think it is all the. I think all the axles were Tecumseh. Tecumseh, no, yeah, Tecumesh. All the gearboxes, yeah, I think they were, and they always seem to break. I've got a windowsill at home that's full of all the broken parts. I'd be happy to say there's very few bits of a mower gearbox that I haven't managed to break one way or another. A lot of gears that I've either managed to break teeth off of or just worn down, as well as sort of the gear shift forks I've broken, the differentials completely gone, and broken the casings in occasions. Another question, is there any limit on the wheel track width? Does it have to remain standard? So the rules that I race with states a maximum track width of, I believe, 42 inches. I think the wheelbase has to remain very, very similar, kind of keeping the axles where the wheels originally were, but you can make the mower a bit wider. at the moment, it's one of the big limitations I have, that my mower was built to kind of fit in the back of our Land Rover, and so it's not making use of the width that the rules allow, and as a result it is more prone to going on two wheels around corners, and it's one of the things I'm going to look at when I build another machine, lowering the chassis and making the mower wider to try and improve stability. There's a question, are we allowed to use a variator drive? So I believe the rules state, at least for the modified class, we're not allowed to use any sort of continuous variable transmission. So that generally does limit it to using belts or chain drive, depending on the clutch system. Whilst I've used a 90-degree gearbox built into the axle, some people use a 90-degree gearbox halfway down the mower and then a separate axle at the back, but we're not allowed to use any sort of variator drive. We would be allowed to use a gearbox with different gear changes, but to be honest, it's not really needed. I don't see when you'd have time to change gears. The torque of these, the engines being the V-twins, is very good, so it's not really a problem. So then Alan said, ice racing looks like fun. Yeah, it really does look like fun. So it's something that I want to try at one point, but I can also imagine it's quite cold. Generally, they'll have studded tyres, and as I say, racing on a frozen lake. And he's asked a few other questions. Well, was I able to work with other students and inspire them before and during lockdown? So yes, I have. I did work with several different students at various points. There was one friend from uni I had came around my house one point when we were rebuilding an engine. They didn't have that much mechanical experience, and I was able to show them how an engine works whilst I was rebuilding one to get it ready, and kind of share the joy of taking apart an engine and putting it back together and having it running on the test bench. And he said, was the funding from the Douglas Bomford Scholarship useful? That was exceptionally useful. Part of that enabled me to buy things like my spare engine, which I then rebuilt with a friend. I've had another friend that I've had a go on it and done a bit of work with me on it. And this is where I'm also looking to get several students involved when I move to the 6 and 12-hour races, as I'm unable, even at a 6-hour race, if I want to drive on my own, I'll still need some sort of pit crew for when things break. Dave Clare's noticed that some have handlebars rather than steering wheels. I've never experienced the handlebars on where I've tried. I like the steering wheel. There are a few that run handlebars. I think that's mostly because of the grip position they just seem to prefer, and you can maybe get more leverage on it, but I quite like keeping the original steering wheel, even if, well, I don't really have a problem with it because I've never tried anything different. And is there a speed record? I would love to do a speed record, but at the moment it's set very high. It's something that Honda and I think Vikings have both been competing at. So I believe the current record is 134 mile an hour set by Vikings. I believe they fitted an LS V8 under the bonnet. It very much doesn't look like a mower. It uses a mower bonnet, and I think they still have to be able to cut grass at a low speed, but otherwise are generally a lot crazier than the sort of machines that we race. So I'd quite like to try and do a speed record, but I think the funding you'd need behind it to go up against the mights of Honda and Vikings, it would be a serious project. And yeah, I think that's all the questions, but if anyone has anything else, let me know. I'll stay around for a little bit. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed learning more about mower racing.
I'll say thank you, Matthew.
Yes, thank you very much there, Matthew. Yeah, I'm certainly enjoyed by a very large audience, which is nice to see, and a very varied, well, from different parts of the country. So I think with that, we'll say thank you very much. And well, as Matthew said, he'll also hang around if there's any other bits that want to carry on. So to everybody else, I'll say cheerio and well, stay safe and keep well, so to speak.